This is Mark at Original Customs, and this video is talking about the Schadek VW oil pump used on Type 1 and Type 4 motors. And specifically on this video, I'm going to be looking at and talking about the Type 4 engine. This is what you get in the package, aside from the cover. What we have here comes with the gaskets, the outer one that goes between the case and the pump body, and the cover gasket. We've got gears and the pump body. This pump as it sits here has been modified. What I call the nose piece has been trimmed down about 2.5–3 millimeters, and this post has been just ground down just slightly with an abrasive wheel to give a little more clearance to the bolt heads. The gears, this one's left alone. This gear the pin is pressed in as far as it'll go. Use an abrasive to smooth this surface, make sure that's completely flat and that my pin isn't protruding in front of the gear face. On the back side, the drive tang has been shortened just slightly, added a little curve to it, and radius those edges, and then all that's checked in the case to make sure there's enough clearance. I'm not actually going to use the pump to case gasket, and the pump to cover will depend on the clearance between the body and the gears. Because we can increase that if it's not enough. Add that gasket in there, and now you've got the thickness of the paper, more clearance. And that can also depend on what you're trying to do with the pump and what you're trying to do with the engine, what kind of life it's going to have. A little bit of surfacing. You can see in the glare pattern, and then the same thing on the pump body. You can see how it almost comes in to this groove, and I think that's a pretty good place to stop. We've got even consistent pattern where all of our sealant will be, and then nothing touching in here, which is fine. Any oil that's moving outward will travel into this groove, and the negative pressure, the suction, will sort of suck back any leaking oil. Now if you're pulling a Schadek or any other pump with a cover like this off of a running motor, there will always be some round machine wear kind of marks for each gear. So in the case, I also check the parting line match between the two pieces. This is a place that, especially on motors that are tight on the budget, there's very little that can be done, and you're sort of left to the mercy of what comes in the door. These studs have been replaced from the originals. I end up using studs for the 30mm pump that are about 40 millimeters long, and run those in as far as I can. I really try to take special time to make sure that the pump studs are as short as possible to get good clamping, but no extra threads showing, because if you ever have to pull a pump with the motor in a car or with the fan housing on, the only way it's going to happen is if these are as short as possible. So with these, you can just barely slip the pump in around the studs. You kind of have to hook the tops in first, and then it swings into place and drive it in. And then you drop the gears in, and you can do all of that with the fan housing in place and or the motor in place. To check the gear to cover clearance on the pumps, I've got my surface plate here, and the drive gear is in place, and I've got my dial indicator zeroed out on the gear, and then 0.05 millimeters of movement between up and down. So just for an example, I'm going to put the gasket in here, zero this out again, and then do the test again. 0.19 millimeters. One of the other checks is to measure the gear height. So we've got the height gauge on the surface plate here, zero it out, and then lift that up and bring the other gear in. And so those are exactly the same height. Loctite 518. This is what I use for all the high pressure sealing on these cases. So it's on the gallery plugs, It's on the oil filter console surface. And I use these acid brushes. This one I've trimmed up the bristles a bit so they're a little more rigid, and just brush it on. And what I'm looking for is a light coat, so what you see there is crazy. It's way too much. And so what I'll do is just go around and try to get the excess off and then move around, go back and steal some from one of those heavy spots and work that around. I don't generally bother going on the outside of the bolts. That area shouldn't be seeing oil if the rest of the sealant is doing its job. And then I'll put a little bit around the ports. Again, just trying to be light. No heavy globs all the way around. One of the reasons I like the acid brush is that it leaves ridges in the sealant. And those ridges to me are what settles out. It's like having a bunch of zigzaggy mountains, and then as you squish those down, they all move out. Similar really to how thin set is applied to tile with grooves so that there's room for it to smooth out to a nice even layer. All right, now we'll put sealant on the body. Again, we don't need to go way out around the bolt holes. And these I usually go a little bit heavier because if you look closely, machining grooves are going to fill up with sealant. So you kind of have extra surface area. You're trying to really fill those grooves in. So you end up needing to go a little bit heavier on the pump body itself. Just following those lines. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go around and really just try and kind of paint this whole thing to give it sort of a starting coat. Now I'm going to go back again. I'm trying to bulk this layer up just slightly without going too heavy. Again, I'm kind of looking for the ridges that get left behind by the acid brush. I'm looking for a little darker color. And finally, around the ports. All right. So that's our case and body. With the drive gear on top. And we're going to stick it in. Now we're looking to drive the body into the case. These studs here and here don't have nuts on them yet and aren't torqued, obviously, to leave the case a little bit of movement as this goes in, but it's still a pretty tight fit often, and it should be. The tighter the clearance, the better the pump. So you just use a little dead blow hammer to start working that in. And then gradually harder. And once it's squared up, it goes in pretty well. So that's seated up all the way. Next step is we're going to drop the drive gear into place. That just happened to be lined up. Normally it'll stop, and you just kind of twist it until it drops into place. And the idle gear goes in the bottom. Now we're ready for some sealant for our cover. And when I put this on, I'm trying to stay outside of that line we talked about earlier. That's a oil suction line, which means you don't want it plugged up with sealant. Otherwise it can't do its job. And this is a perfect example of why a light amount of sealant can really be necessary. So if you glob this on heavy, Guess where half of that sealant's going to end up? Right in that groove. Little Q-tip with some solvent. I really want that to just be clean. I don't want any chances for that. And actually, I'm gonna go all the way around. This is sort of an accident. I don't normally do this, but I'm kind of liking how it's coming out. Take this Q-tip and just stay in the groove. I end up cleaning a little ring around the outside, which should be pretty much perfect for the sealant squish. So I actually like that better than any one I've done before. And sometimes that's the process of building a motor, is figuring out some things that you didn't know before, some different ways to do things. Always learning, always trying new stuff. This one I'm gonna also paint, and this one I'm really just looking for just a minute amount. I'm actually gonna go back after this and get rid of as much as I can. I don't know where that ring's gonna sit on this. So I'm gonna go back and just use my finger to try and just be left with the thinnest smear. Yeah, you can barely see that. That's exactly what I want. This down here is almost a little heavy. Yeah, there we go. Right. Already cleaned up my hands now. Got my hardware ready to go. Throw these on now. I just use wave washers and normal M8 nuts. So I'm just lightly running this on until it sort of stops. And this just goes to 14 foot-pounds on each one. And then I double check. Notice the crisscross pattern. And as you can see, the threads are just at the end of the nuts, just like I want them to be. You can see the nuts that are just flush with the studs. Then one last step for me is to go back and clean up any of the excess sealant that's squished out. And it shouldn't be too much if you've applied your sealant correctly, and not too heavy. And the final step here for the installation is to install those two case perimeter nuts that I mentioned earlier. And then finally, I go back and just make sure those are all right where they should be. I like to give a little bit of time for things to settle, just in case something was held up and moves over time. Give it a little bit, one more check. All right, and one last subject I want to cover is removing these pumps. It can be a little bit challenging because there's not much to grab onto. Obviously, remove the 4 nuts, washers, pop the cover off. If you're looking to reseal something that's just leaking a little bit, I would say that it's best for you to spend some time evaluating whether it's the cover that's leaking or the body, or something like the main seal up above. But if the cover is leaking, then don't pull the body, because that's a bunch of work. So basically try to avoid that if you can. Plus, if it's not leaking, don't disturb it. But if you do need to remove the body, take the cover off, and then in this area there's a bit of a lip that you can grab onto. There's not much down here, but on the other side there's a couple of places that you can get in there, and what I'll often do is get a screwdriver against this mount stud there, and just kind of pull that way to get it started. Screwdriver or pry bar on both sides, so that you can kind of work independently and together to jimmy that out. It'll slowly start to work its way out. Once you get it out a ways, be careful of getting on the sealing surface, because deformations there can cause issues. The biggest problem with resealing these, pulling them and resealing them, is all those heavy machine marks that I was showing you earlier in the video, because it's really challenging to get those completely clean, get all the old sealant out, and it's almost better to try and seal over the top of the old sealant, which is bad practice, but there's not much choice in these with the machining as it is. Either that, or you can spend a lot of time with a solvent and maybe a wire brush, but you're always sort of running the risk of creating grooves, scratches, things of that nature. So you do have to be careful. If you want to go all the way, time is the best investment. Take your time, clean it slowly, thoroughly, and then go back and reseal it the way that I indicated earlier in the video.